I have a few rules that I obey, and sometimes I try to break as well as a photographer when I'm shooting still frames or if I'm shooting 24 frames a second as a director of photography and motion picture production. Um, Rutledge would say that these compositional rules are hard and fast, and you need to follow them if you want to have any kind of credibility when it comes to your ability to compose. And while I agree with that, after you master those concepts, then you can get into maybe more creative ways of using these ideas or maybe even breaking them. I kind of resist any kind of absolutes that are out there that way. So, in terms of composition, we're talking about how we lead the eye as a designer through the frame. And that again could be in terms of just a still frame, or it could be 24 frames a second as we're shooting in motion picture as well that way. A number of ideas to consider, like vectors, the diagonal rule, the rule of thirds, frame forces, and lastly, oh, that's it, and frame forces. I went through those too quickly. Let me do those one more time so you get them down. I thought I had. Oh, I'm going to do one more here that deals with the Gestalt principle of foreground and background as a concept there. I'm not going to really test you on that, but it's something worth considering here. So vectors being lines that draw you in, and they have a lot to do with actually with the diagonal rule. There are three different types of vectors. What the rule of thirds does to us really in setting us up to really default to what's called the golden mean, and then frame forces. So, all right, now we can move on. When I first moved to Salt Lake City, I decided to go out and do a little shooting, and just to take a look at compression using a long lens and pulling some things together and looking at a lot of strong vertical lines and some horizontal lines and things. And so this, what you're seeing here is a take from that. It's nothing great by any stretch of the imagination, but it does demonstrate compositional forces that I I default to anymore. I don't even really think about it. It just happens as I go through and compose, put something together. And if you're a photographer or shooter, you might look at the same thing and think, well, I go to compose it a little bit differently or whatever. We all bring something different to the image, like this one here in terms of looking right straight downtown. This is looking down Main Street. You see buildings that are obviously germane to Salt Lake City skyline there with what's going on. But there are a number of forces that are happening within this. One has to do with the diagonal rule. And believe it or not, there's a diagonal, a subtle one, that's evolved here, and that happens to be Main Street. As you see, go through that canyon that's created by the buildings. And what that's doing is it's leading your eye either from front to back or back to front there as you go through the compression of those buildings as the telephoto lens has kind of crunched them all together along that z-axis that you're looking at. So there's one rule going working hard there. There's kind of a vector within that. I'll get into vectors here in just a minute. Rule of thirds is being used on this, but mostly on the vertical axes. The rule of thirds, if you took a tic-tac-toe grid, okay, and you drew that on this square, so all the lines were equidistal, the same distance from each other, you'd start to see within that certain bisections where lines come together, where there might be something of interest. Not so much in this one, maybe in this one here. Certainly the old courthouse building with that kind of steeple on there almost falls on a bisection of that tic-tac-toe grid in the rule of thirds. We also have some diagonal rules happening here. We have the patterns of the vertical lines that are going on a diagonal, again, into the z-axis of the photograph. And it gives your eye, it moves your eye to the frame here. Maybe something a little simpler to look at in terms of these ideas. And there's some vectors at work here too. So first off, we have the rule of thirds. You can see how the towers on this mansion, left and right, kind of fall on the vertical axes of that tic-tac-toe grid. And then we have the diagonal rules in terms of the horizontal fence, the iron fencing there that lead your eye, again, on that z-axis, pointing right down into the main entrance of this mansion that's downtown Salt Lake on South Temple. Now, these are also vectors. A diagonal rule plays into what's called vectors, and these are kind of architectural, what we might call a graphic vector that just leads your eye. The three types of vectors. There's a motion vector, which I don't have an example of here. I'll talk about that one here in just a minute. An index vector, which is what we're talking about now, using architectural or line basically to point in a direction to lead your eye into something, okay? And then graphic vectors, which are much like index vectors. Actually, graphic vectors are more architectural. The index vectors are more graphic in that respect. I've just confused you even more. I'm going to go to another image that I'll confuse you more in terms of how those vectors work. The bottom line is vectors work to go through and pull your eye and move your eye through the frame using the diagonal rule. The diagonal rule, remember, as we go back to the theory on line, is if we have a line and a diagonal, it tends to draw your eye on the z-axis from front to back or back to front within the frame. And that's what's going on here. We have these horizontal steps that are kind of inviting you into this. It's a little peaceful, but then we have the barrier of the gates. There's a little kind of a paradox going on here. Imagine how much more inviting this might be if we removed the graphic vectors of the fence and what that would have done here, perhaps, to get us up the steps and maybe get us into the building. Well, ironically, now here's a building you can't get into unless you're a mason. Okay, sound familiar? And there are some vectors hard at work here. The railings here are almost an index vector. While they're architectural, they're kind of pointing in a direction. They're going up and leading you to the doors in terms of what's going on. The rule of thirds is hard at work here as well. The head of this I don't know what to call that thing, the line with the ball with the human head. The head rests right on that bisection of the rule of thirds, the tic-tac-toe grid, to go through and pull some interest here. I don't know if you've paid attention to how your eye has been scanning this image, but when I took the photograph, as I looked at it before I framed it up, frame forces come into play here, okay, because they box this in and then become compositional forces that we really don't even recognize. But before I framed this up, my eye went up the stairs along the railing, and then it got interrupted by the very interesting detail of whatever that animal kind of thing with the black ball is. So it moves. The guy goes up and it goes to the left, up and goes to the left. It almost doesn't let you out of the image there, in fact. So let's see, did I cover everything with that one? So I got rule of thirds, I got diagonal, I got vectors, the graphic vector going up, almost an index vector. I don't have any motion vector. I told you what I was going to tell you what a motion vector was. If you were to photograph a car, let's make this easier, a person on a bicycle, and they were riding along a street, and they're riding in front of you, so they're going left to right, and you photograph them in the frame, and you leave room in the frame for them to ride into. Okay, they become what's called a motion vector. The eye looks to the direction that bicycle might be going. The same is true with an arrow. The same is true with a car, with a rocket, with anything that moves. Okay, a running dog. If you provide room in front of that dog while it's running in your composition, it creates a motion vector. Okay, we're watching that room be created in front of that individual, in front of that pooch, in order for them to run into. Now, if we took away that room, John Frankenheimer, a famous director, did incredible car chases. He was the one who did the car chase in Ronin. He would take the vehicle and push it right up against the frame and remove room for the automobile to go into, creating this dissonance on the viewer's part because there's no escape and they're going to crash because we are tied to those frame forces in terms of what's going on. So he creates an index vector by bringing the vehicle in the chase into the scene and then smashes it up, not literally, figuratively, up against the frame and creates anxiety for the user, creates some tension, which is terrific, in going through and getting your audience enveloped into the story. What is it you're trying to do? So this is the image that I want to talk about in terms of foreground, background as compositional elements. This is up for great debate. A lot of people talk about them. Because there's also the plane of clarity, the depth of field, all those kinds of things. But nonetheless, here's what it is I'm talking about. Let me get into some better basic ideas and applications here of what it is that I'm talking about. I have 3 models here, Daniel, Lindsay, and I think Amber is her name, in terms of how we're applying these compositional elements to the face, to the human form. If we were shooting dialogue, for example, or an interview or something along that line. The first that comes to mind here is the rule of thirds. If you place that tic-tac-toe grid, you would see a bisection just on the bridge of Daniel's nose. His eyes would come right above that intersection. He has some lead room, interesting, on the camera left side, on the left side of the image. And he's almost kind of bouncing off that right frame line there. He flirts a bit with the frame that's the closest to his face. And for Daniel, it's on that right side. And it forces almost an energy that comes off that right side and then back to you, the viewer. Even though his eyes are coming to what's called to you subjectively, there's that energy that's going on within this. Imagine if we took the frame and we panned it right a little bit and put them right in the middle, we would lose that energy. It would go away. Because the frame forces on the left and the right side of the frame are no longer competing to draw Daniel's face to one side or the other. That's what this does. It sets it up and makes it a little bit more interesting. With Lindsay, it's the same way. But she's going to camera left frame side. Okay, again, rule of thirds is there, right on the bridge of her nose. Her eyes will go through and kind of balance on the 2 sides of where the intersection happens on that rule of thirds. But the frame goes through, and again, she kind of bounces off the camera left side. Her energy does, the way her face goes into that, but her eyes come right back to you. Okay, and it makes it more authentic. There's something a little bit more genuine here in terms of what's going on. I guess I better show you that image because there we go, I had it in my brain. So she's coming off camera left side, looking into the camera, the rule of thirds going on. You see how that bisects, how that sets it up. It is asymmetrical in its composition, meaning there's a little more negative space on the right side, camera right side, than there is on the camera left side. And it goes through and creates more energy. Amber's composition exploits that rule of thirds as well, but the energy here is more riveting on her eyes by the placement and the lack of influence of the frame. Okay, we have a small frame that is inside this that kind of cancels out the main frame of the image, which is probably the frame of your computer as you're looking at this, or the frame of the YouTube video that this will eventually upload to. Okay, but she's framed out by her hoodie, and then she has the blackness of her hair goes through and interrupts that frame. So there's all kinds of things happening. There's no ricochet like the 2 previous to this. But there's a what's called a subcomposition here, and the contrast of her hair and the hoodie against the black, making its own frame. And then there's this incredible agreement going on between her eyes and the smile that's going on with that. That's contrast artwork within this too, which arguably could also be a compositional factor. So you have an assignment, and the assignment is to create a photograph. I don't want you to find one. I want you to create one. Shoot it with your iPhone, shoot it with your camera, whatever you have to shoot with, that incorporates at least these 3 ideas: the rule of thirds, okay, the diagonal rule, and some kind of vectors here going on. I failed to mention that the eyes of all 3 of these models are vectors. Where the eyes are pointing are vectors. There's energy going to where they point. They happen to be pointing at you, the viewer, here. So we get that energy off them. If they were looking in a direction left, then we would look left, or we would look right there. So the eyes are very powerful, I guess we'd call those index vectors, maybe even motion vectors, to go through and get you looking through the frame. So the idea is for your assignment, and it's in the rubric, for you to create an image. We're not going to evaluate your photography here, but we're looking at your ability to compose an image, executing the rule of thirds, the diagonal rule, and vectors within that. Okay? If you have any questions, you know where to find me.